reduction is the idea in drug policy that we should be focused primarily on stopping people from getting hurt, not stopping them from getting high.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, and I'm joined on this podcast, as always, by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And What Could Go Right is our weekly podcast where we talk to people, sometimes members of the Progress Network, sometimes not, who are taking a more constructive view, a more constructive attitude toward all the destructive things in the world.
Yeah, so one of those voices when it comes to drugs, addiction, and public policy is Maya Salovitz, who we're going to be speaking to today. She's a columnist at The Times, where she covers all those topics, and she's also the author of a few books. The most recent one is Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. So we are very much looking forward to talking about how she's been one of those people to help shift the culture around all of this.
Maya, thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously, no one would know this except you and I, that we've known each other for many decades since college and have been, I think, both of us thinking about issues about America and drug policy. And the drug thing, I mean, when we were in college in whenever that was a while back, it seemed like the last thing in the world, given that this was like the beginning of the war on drugs, that American attitudes about drugs, about things that we called illegal drugs, let's be clear about that it seemed like just never in my lifetime would those attitudes soften.
Yeah, so my most recent book, Undoing Drugs, is actually about precisely that. Like, how did we go from just say no, lock them all up, addiction is a character flaw, to legal marijuana in, I think, more than half the states now, continuing to go. 2 states have legal psychedelics for therapeutic use. Harm reduction has been adopted by the Biden administration, if only sporadically, but definitely prior to that, the whole concept of being kind to drug users and keeping them alive if they weren't willing to immediately become abstinent was just, when just after I was in college with you, I had my own addiction struggles, and I was injecting drugs, and this was the mid 80s, and it was the worst time to be injecting drugs in New York City. 50% of people who were doing so were already HIV positive. And I didn't even know, once I found out that this was a risk for people who shot drugs, I immediately became outraged that not only did people not want to tell us how to protect ourselves, which was as easy as cleaning your needles with bleach, but they wanted to actively discourage people from finding this out, let alone give them clean needles, because otherwise it would encourage drug use. And the young kids who would see that we survived would be badly influenced. And I just thought that's just like a horrible, horrible thing. And I saw that gay people were organizing. ACT UP was a big inspiration, and I was just, why don't we have that for people with addiction? And so I, once I managed to get into recovery myself, I basically began a career in journalism, trying to understand why we have this ridiculous policy. And one of the fundamental reasons I rapidly learned is racism. And one of the biggest reasons that we've been able to move away from this has been sort of one gross kind of force, which is, oh gosh, the opioid epidemic is white, so therefore we could be nice to people. And the much more salutary influence is that of Michelle Alexander and her book, The New Jim Crow, which, there was enormous support for the war on drugs in Black communities for a really long time. And she unraveled why that is a bad idea. And that change stopped giving white politicians cover for supporting this very racist policy. And so between that, the marijuana legalization movement, and the fact that states that legalized pot did not have the sky fall or madmen suddenly running in the streets, stabbing people everywhere. In fact, there is more of that goes on in places that have not legalized. But the fact that, this big bugaboo that everybody was so terrified of, and what about the children? And pretty much nothing happened, at least in relation to that directly. So, so we've had like all of these forces. And yeah, in the 80s and 90s, it was really difficult to imagine. I mean, even talking about decriminalizing possession of marijuana. Oh no, you're going to send the wrong message. And it's like, well, we've been sending the right message for, God knows how many years now at this point. And what do we have? The worst overdose death crisis in history.
Maya, I wonder if you could dig a little bit into what harm reduction is. I didn't even realize that the Biden administration had adopted that as its approach. So I'm hoping you could give the basic explanation. What is it? What is it trying to do? Practically speaking, what does it look like?
Harm reduction is the idea in drug policy that we should be focused primarily on stopping people from getting hurt, not stopping them from getting high. In action, the most classic example is syringe exchange. You give people clean needles so they won't get bloodborne diseases, and so that when they do get into recovery, which most people do eventually, they will not have life-threatening illnesses that need to be treated very expensively if that is your concern. So there are sort of various levels of acceptance of harm reduction. It could be anything from, legalizing to, because in many cases, prohibition is causing more harm than the substances themselves. And so if you're thinking about this in a harm reduction context, it's like, well, if we want to reduce the most harm, these laws are actually increasing harm. So, that, of course, has not been embraced by the Biden administration. But what they have said is that their official drug policy includes harm reduction measures, which are everything from syringe exchange to distributing the overdose antidote naloxone to having housing where abstinence is not required. Although interestingly enough, that started in the Bush administration, because so much of homelessness, people were never getting housed because you had to jump through all these hoops, like I'll get sober before I get housed. That's really going to happen, right? So, I mean, occasionally, obviously, but so it has been embraced sort of on a small level within the policies that are officially called harm reduction, but not so much on the level of thinking about what we do. And I mean, a classic example would be something like, okay, we had overprescribing of opioids. A lot of people misunderstand this because they think that the people who got addicted were pain patients. 80% of people who misuse prescription opioids did not have a prescription for them when they started. So these are overwhelmingly not pain patients. And a lot of pain patients are suffering because they can no longer get access to medications that actually help them. But that is another topic. So what did we do when we discovered that, we had this going on? Okay, we'll cut the medical supply. This will solve this. And so we cut the medical supply. It's back down to, by some measures, the rates before OxyContin was introduced. So it's really quite low. And in fact, at that time in the 90s, this was seen quite rightly as people did not have enough access to them when they were dying or had severe chronic pain that was the equivalent of death kind of pains that you were going to have for 30 years, not just a few months. So anyway, so we just cut the medical supply back down to where it was when we widely acknowledged that it was not adequate, even before pharma marketing pushed that too far. So, okay, we did this. We did not do a single thing to help all those patients, whether they were pain patients who were getting cut off from, and still had pain, or they were people with addiction who were getting medical opioids, which are much safer than street fentanyl. So we just cut them off, and oh gee, how did it happen that gangsters came in there? If you have a harm reduction view, you cannot create a policy that does more harm. When you're thinking through policy, you have to think, oh, okay, what's going to happen if we stop this? Oh yeah, addiction actually exists. So people are going to try to find another source. They're not going to be cured when you just take away one source of the substance, if only that were true, but it is absolutely not, right? So anyway, that's just an example from recent history, but really harm reduction requires thinking of policy in context. And so, for example, another one would be, we have this herb called kratom or kratom. Nobody really knows how to pronounce it, but I've asked many times and people just pronounce it how they want. But anyway, this stuff is essentially a very mild opioid. And it's available as a supplement because we don't regulate supplements very well. But so there was this whole, oh gosh, this is an opioid, we should ban this, it's bad. Well, in the context of fentanyl, you want to ban an opioid that is incredibly hard to overdose on. That would be really stupid. And in fact, so far, and for the first time in recent memorable history, the FDA wanted to ban it and they didn't. They weren't able to because people said this is a really stupid idea. This is going to worsen health.
I mean, it's funny, I guess the flip side of my optimism about changing attitudes toward marijuana and legalization, changing attitudes towards the therapeutic use of psychedelics is, it's almost as if you look at the past 100 years of policy toward various mind-altering substances, let's just call them that, it's almost as if American society kind of needs a drug demonization of choice at any given moment. So you have the end of prohibition in you have prohibition in the 20s, demon alcohol, destroying families, ruining stuff. And then you have the repeal of prohibition, and suddenly marijuana becomes like the, reefer madness, and it's the thing that's going to destroy families, and on and on and on. And then really in the past 10 to 15 years, almost in weirdly inverse lockstep with relaxed attitude towards marijuana and psychedelics, you have this intense reaction against all opioids, to the point where, if you watch Dopesick on, I think it was Hulu, Patrick Radden Keefe's book, Empire of Pain, the Sacklers are depicted as these sort of, maniacal. Maybe they were, right. I mean, it's not, I don't even know.
Jump in here, because, the New York Times, I think last week or recently had another piece about the evil Sacklers funding something. All of this focus, yes, they are bad. They did bad things. But if you continue to focus on the medical supply, when we have street fentanyl killing at least 100,000 people per year, this is really stupid. What you're going to do by further cutting the medical supply is further increase the market for street fentanyl. Dopesick promoted, unfortunately, a lot of ridiculous myths about the addictiveness of opioids. For example, there's that ridiculous scene where the doctor, somebody's like, he's about to have surgery. He's like, oh no, I can't have opioids because I will turn into a zombie. And it's like, dude, you're not at risk. First of all, the one thing that people never think about is, okay, let's say you get opioids in the hospital. You don't even have a prescription. Most people are not comfortable buying street drugs if they haven't previously done so. Even if you have previously done so, especially to not get ripped off, it is hard to do. You don't get supplied with a drug dealer when you get opioids in the hospital. And the idea that the thing that is also really annoying. So, okay. All of the opioid companies in Purdue, they said only 1% of people who get exposed medically get addicted. That is actually true with one caveat: if they don't have a prior history of addiction of any type. And so, most addictions, 90% of addictions begin before the age of 25. So if you're talking about a 40-year-old woman with MS who has zero history of addiction, the chances that you're going to give her a prescription and she's going to start robbing pharmacies are enormously low. But we can't have this subtlety in our policies, right? And I do think, yes, we have this history of, we have one demon drug after another. That is definitely a thing. But we also go through periods where there really isn't, methamphetamine sort of was a drug scare, but it really didn't affect that many people. And perhaps more importantly, for not creating a drug scare, it's really rare in New York City, except for among gay men. And so, we're a coke town. But
good to know. Thanks.
It's actually really interesting. Nobody can really explain, but it's like you see very, very, it may be that whatever the consumer, the drug dealers, prefer selling, they have connections for whatever it is. But the thing is that we also have plenty of other areas to create moral panics, unfortunately, which we are seeing around trans people right now. And so while we definitely tend to go from one drug scare to another, which of course is really great in okay, I won't do that drug that, my older sister nearly died from. I'll do this one instead because this one is not demonized yet. And, it's just a stupid way to do policy.
I mean, demon drugs and moral panics aside, do you think that there is a increasing acceptance around addiction issues? I mean, I was thinking about this because John Mulaney, who of course is a celebrity, he's a stand-up comic, but his whole Netflix special that just came out was an hour, 50 minutes on him going through addiction, which to your point started apparently at age 14.
When I first got to rehab, one of my biggest fears was that everyone was going to recognize me. Gradually, a new fear took over. I'm not like exaggerating to be funny. Fucking no one. No one knew who I was. And it was driving me bananas. Please don't repeat this. It was in the newspaper that I was in rehab, and I left it out. I was like, hey, oh my God, the paper's here. Get in here, you addicts. Oh my God. I wonder what's inside.
It's hard to imagine, and again, he's a celebrity, he's sort of held to different standards, but it's hard to imagine that happening 10 years ago. I mean, I am sort of the era when celebrities going to rehab was like, oh my God,
Well, no, I disagree. Everybody gone to rehab. It was I think it began to become destigmatized in the 80s when the peak of this probably would have been early 90s when New York Magazine ran a story about why single women should go to AA to pick up men.
I'm really glad I missed that.
Right. So, and I mean, this is when the movie The Player came out, and people who didn't have problems were going to AA because that's where the deals were being made. So there was this whole recovery thing. The destigmatization of recovery has really come a long way, I think. What has not been destigmatized is continuing active use. What also has not been destigmatized, unfortunately, is anything other than 12-step treatment. And we still have this idea that that is the one true way, and that if you don't recover that way, you're not really in recovery. And if you use medication, you're not really in recovery. I do think that, also, is there a rock star that hasn't gone to rehab? I mean, I naively, when I was trying to organize around, trying to get people to do something around AIDS and IV drug use, I'm like, okay, every guitarist, probably every bass player and drummer too, singers, whatever, they all shoot up. So why wouldn't they do a benefit for needle exchange? This seems like a good thing to, but of course, they didn't want that to be their image, even though they sang songs like Heroin or Cocaine by Heroin by Clapton and Cocaine by Lou Reed. No, I've got them backwards. But the point being that they did plenty that glamorized drugs during their careers. And the idea that now they would only support people who are already abstinent, or people who are willing to go and attempt to be abstinent, Okay, so we're going to let them get AIDS when they relapse or before they are able to get into treatment. Like, this is ridiculous. But I was obviously very naive about the commercial pressures on musicians and how actually rock and roll they are.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned this because there's also this whole strain of reality that doesn't enter into the mix at all because it's frankly more banal. So we talk about addiction and people whose lives fall apart. My friend Anne Marlowe, I think in the 90s, wrote this book, Heroin A to Z, about, it was a memoir about her as a very successful, high-powered headhunter who also had an active, continuous heroin habit. And this was not like a defense of her having a heroin habit any more than, books about people drinking as a defense of being an alcoholic. It was an articulation of, you can actually be a high-functioning drug user, right? That it's not like one shot of anything.
Most people who use drugs are not addicted. Even when you're talking about something like heroin, probably 30% of users become addicted at max. Typically the range is 10 to 20% for alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. It's a little bit less for weed. It's a little bit more for nicotine in the form of cigarettes. It's almost non-existent for the classic psychedelics. So, a lot of the drug war was about teaching people lies, creating this idea that like, oh, we can't tell people that only 10 to 20, because that's a high rate of addiction actually. But would you fly in a plane that crashes 20% of the time? But we couldn't tell people that, oh no, that 80% don't, oh no, we can't be talking about that. And also, I think actually when we're talking about what brought about the change in drug policy, a undermentioned thing is the internet. Because when the internet first started, it was populated by deadheads, computer geeks, people who liked drugs, basically. And there was honest information about the risks and benefits that was on there. Like, it took many years before the prohibitionists caught up with the pro-legalization message that was throughout the early internet. And I think I had a letter in the New England Journal of Medicine because somebody wrote like, oh my God, people are getting their drug information from these, like strange sites. They should be going to the honest government sites. And it's like, really? Honest? Like marijuana turns you into a heroin addict instantly? Like, I mean, to be fair, the government sites have become much better. And if you were actually looking in the medical literature, you would find much more honest stuff. But, honest information on drugs from the DEA and the drug czar.
So I'm curious where we are actually in terms of the medical literature on addiction, because I imagine that has also improved or just changed. I know it used to be addiction was considered to be a brain disease. Is that still where we're at, or what does current research say?
You can't really, disease is a cultural term. It's not a medical term. What used to be argued, in my view, dumbly, was addiction is a disease because drugs change the brain. Okay, so learning is a disease, right? Because, learning changes the brain, right? Walking is, it's just like, it's a dumb argument. Everything that has an impact or sensory experience changes the brain. Otherwise you couldn't experience it unless you're talking about the soul, which we don't really want to be doing in a scientific context, right? So, the thing about the problem with seeing addiction as a brain disease there's twofold problem. One is this has become extremely associated with the 12-step view that abstinence is the only acceptable way to treat it. It has, the 12-step groups and people who sort of believe in that ideology say, it's a chronic progressive brain disease. But the thing is, if you actually look at the literature, and most of the findings in the addiction literature are really old, they're just now way more replicated. Like if you looked at the medical literature compared to what the popular press was saying at any given time, there was much more sense, because like when you actually have to like do an experiment, you're going to have, you know, unless you're a dishonest scientist, you're going to have to deal with what the actual results are rather than, okay, well, this will fit into my propaganda, so I'll publish this and I'll put this in the file drawer. Which I actually think there's a lot of file drawer literature on the harms of marijuana that failed to pan out, and also people don't like to publish null results anyway. The point there is that yes, the medical understanding has expanded, and part of this is because it really was a backwater for many years, and really the only people who wanted anything to do with it were like doctors and researchers who were in recovery or, you know, some kind of drug users themselves. So, you know, the American Society for Addiction Medicine, which thankfully has really changed a lot, but it was originally founded by diehard 12-steppers who opposed the use of medication, even though probably 20 years ago, we already knew that for opioid addiction, the only thing that reduces the death rate is staying on methadone or buprenorphine. Now, buprenorphine is newer, but methadone's been known for years. 50% reduction in mortality with staying on these drugs. So advocating abstinence in light of that, in my view, is malpractice. Now, again, this does not mean that individual patients should not aim for abstinence if that's what they want to do, especially since obtaining these drugs, especially methadone, from our horrible system is a horrible pain in the butt. You often have to go every day. Your counselor can say, oh no, you can't go on that business trip. I mean, it's really bad. And there are people working to change this, but the data has really been there for a really long time. It's now like pretty well replicated in terms of how do we see addiction. Like I have obviously written a book that argues for seeing it as a learning disorder or developmental disorder. And I think what was interesting when I was writing the book was like some neuroscientists were like, oh, everybody knows that. Like, why would you write about that? I'm like, everybody does not know this. The main concept in the field is disease. And the main concept in the field is disease that turns you into a zombie, like where you have no free will and that you are, you know, having basically something like Alzheimer's. But when you look at how people with addiction actually behave, that is just not what happens. Like people don't like shoot up in the middle of the street if they have any other option. They don't shoot up in front of the cops if they have any other option, you know, which means that they can delay use, which means that they're not zombies in the sense of have zero free will. The learning disorder perspective, first of all, it accounts for the fact that, gee, it typically comes on at a time that's a sensitive period in brain development, like virtually all other psychiatric conditions, right? Like I think 75% of all mental illness manifests before 25. So there's a sensitive period in brain development that's going on when you're a teenager, and that's when these things often manifest. Other conditions like autism, you can see earlier. There's stuff that's going on in the adolescent brain that can go wrong. And that thankfully for most people does not. But the, you know, so that's the other thing that really deals a fatal blow to the chronic progressive brain disease. First of all, most people recover. But second of all, the rate of recovery is about 15% per year, kind of regardless. And so like a lot of treatment centers will show, oh, we got an 80% success rate. Basically what they do is they're really horrible to people. 80% of people drop out in the first 2 weeks. They have their 80% success rate among graduates, which is 15%, which is the natural rate of recovery. So they've selected out for the unmotivated folks. Anyway, that is another, I could teach an entire course on how to lie with statistics with addiction treatment data.
Yeah, I mean, and the studies are really, they're problematic in terms of their data sets. They're problematic in terms of their methodology. They're almost impossible in terms of their control groups. I mean, mostly because you can't take 1,000 15-year-olds, you know, have 200 of them do heroin regularly, 200 of them do a placebo that they think is heroin, and, you know, 600 do nothing, and then study their lives for the next 20 years. I mean, that, and also somehow normalize for diet and environment and you know, two parent, one parent, all these other environmental factors. But we make these assumptions, some of which are I guess, legitimately correlative. I mean, early studies of the lethality of nicotine were based largely on, correlative stuff,
Absolutely, just
not
huge, massive correlation.
right. But you also had a much larger set of humans. I mean, if like 200 people did heroin, you'd probably come out with an understanding of what the actual risks were.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is we have a pretty good natural experiment on that, which is Vietnam. The American soldiers who went there, around 50% used heroin or opium to the point where they were actually physically dependent. And so Nixon, everybody was panicking. These people are going to come home and they're going to like spread heroin addiction all over the place, and it's going to be a nightmare. What happened when they came home was actually only about 15% like tried it again once they were home. And only about 1 to 2% actually developed long-term addiction, which is pretty similar to the population rate for opioid addiction in general. So, we can say that like, yeah, they were in a pretty stressful situation over there. They were taken out of that stressful situation. Now, there is also some people that will have switched to alcohol or other substances. But the main point is that most people who have access to a pretty decent life do not become addicted to opioids. And the people who do become addicted to opioids overwhelmingly have histories of childhood trauma and or mental illness. Or other developmental differences like autism or whatever. Like, it's not like people who are happy and good at coping get exposed to a substance and then, throw away their lives. That maybe happens very, very rarely. But for the most part, what happens is people discover something that fixes something in them. And eventually it stops working and causes a lot of harm. But at first it seems like, I've solved this problem. And so if you don't have that problem to solve and you do have alternative things that make your life worth living, you're probably not going to, I hear this all the time from people who are like, oh yeah, I had, somebody gave me OxyContin because I broke my leg or whatever. And that was the best thing ever. And I knew that I better not mess with that because I did not want to like lose my job or my wife or my cat. So, those are the stories you never hear because they're really boring. Like who would buy an addiction memoir that was that? We have nothing to talk about. Who we hear from are the people who do get into trouble, who are the minority.
You had a staggering statistic in one of your recent columns in the Times that had to do with what you just said, which is that nearly 75% of women with a heroin addiction were sexually abused as children. I was blown away by that. I mean, where are we, I guess, when it comes to the therapy conversation? Because I have this sort of, I guess, pop therapy idea that we've come a long way with that stuff, that it's more available, that people have better access to it, that it's just more an open part of the conversation. Would you agree with that?
Well, the problem is that historically addiction treatment itself has been traumatic. If you weren't on methadone, the main method of treatment was the so-called therapeutic community. This arose out of a cult called Synanon. The idea was AA isn't tough enough. So, AA wants you to admit you're powerless over the substance. We'll make you feel powerless by, AA wants you to get humility. We'll humiliate you. It was attack therapy. And this is still, unfortunately, prevalent in a lot of places. And it is horrible especially for women who are survivors of sexual abuse. And so the whole idea was we break you down because you have too much of a big ego and you are too arrogant. Yeah, okay, maybe that was fine for the white people who originally, like the white men who originally originated this stuff. But, the vast majority of people with addiction are not like that, and are not like on top of things and need to be brought down. In fact, if you just think about it from common sense, who's more likely to recover? A doctor who has a practice and a wife and a kid and a cat and a dog and whatever, or the homeless guy on the street? I'm going to bet on the doctor, right? But to be fair, there have definitely been advances in treatment, and there's this whole movement now to make treatment trauma informed. Now, you can't do that if you are attacking and humiliating people, because that is trauma producing. Some people, of course, just pick up the buzzword and they don't change what they're doing. But there certainly is a much greater awareness of the role of trauma in addiction. And one of the things about that 75% figure, which also was horrifying to me, was that half of that group was abused more than once. It was like an ongoing thing. It wasn't just like a one-off incident. So it was like a life, I mean, and I can't remember if I used this there, but there was a sort of poetic term for the childhoods of most people with heroin addiction, not in my case, but in many, called shattered childhood. Like they basically had just everything was ruinous. If you look at those like adverse childhood experiences studies, you find like, I think it's something like 8 times greater risk of becoming an injection drug user if you have like 5 or more childhood, different types of child traumatic experience compared to if you have none. Now, most people have at least one. But even having one actually doubles your odds of addiction. And so, so it's, I mean, a lot of the times too, like people have both trauma and mental illness, because oftentimes what turns a predisposition to mental illness into an actual illness is the trauma, especially at a young age. So, what we're trying to do, and hopefully moving away from, is like punishing people for trying to feel better and trying to feel okay. And that produces more desire to use drugs, not less, because you're taking away the thing that the people use to cope, and not giving them other skills.
So, Maya, you've been doing this column for the New York Times for more than a year now. In a world of noise, the Times remains still a more prominent platform that gets more attention. I mean, I notice this when I've done stuff for them, that it doesn't have the impact that it might have once had culturally, but it still has a lot more than most. What are you noticing in terms of feedback? There's obviously some degree of validation of the arguments you've been making. I'm not saying the Times necessarily like in its columnist endorses the views thereof, but there is a willingness to feel like this is a resonant viewpoint. Are you finding that in terms of your reactions? Has that changed some of your sense of where the culture is?
I mean, yeah, the fact that I was able to, become a contributing opinion writer there definitely shows more openness to these perspectives. And so that has been obviously really great for me. I always wanted to do this. It's like I'm having a lot of fun. And yeah, like first of all, people call you back really quickly.
That's nice.
But aside from that, I get enormous amounts of feedback. I think, mostly positive. If you write about 12-step and don't say it's the best thing or the only thing, you're going to get majorly attacked. And that did happen around that particular column. I am not anti-12-step, but I do not think we should be forcing people into it. But yeah, like it's been really interesting to see, how views that were definitely out of the mainstream even 10, 15 years ago are beginning to be accepted, especially since we've seen the failure of the punitive approach. I mean, it's like, do we really think locking more people up for fentanyl is going to fix this? I mean, fentanyl's like, you could supply an entire city with an amount that's this big. You're never going to prevent that by supply side. And who are you going to bust? You're going to bust the lower level people because they're easier to bust. And who are those people? They're going to be people who are addicted themselves. We're just going to continue mass incarceration by doing that. So that was a digression, but it's been really great doing this, and I just want to do it for as long as I can and just get as much accurate and informed information out there to people, because this whole area is just filled with ridiculous myths.
Well, I've certainly been enjoying the columns, and I'm very pleased that you have that platform. I mean, everything you've been writing for the past decades has been, I find, brave and in a culture. I mean, the culture has moved more in your direction, right? So you've been where you are, where you've been much more like the outsider saying, hey, wait a minute, and you know, in ways that I think are quite validating, right? Things have moved, and part of the point that we did the Progress Network and we do this podcast is cultural shifts happen very slowly until they happen very quickly, and the way in which they do is sort of the idea universe is seeded like pebbles in a pond, right? You know, the ripples are going somewhere. You just don't know when they're going to hit the hither shore and what effect they're going to have. And, you know, you have been one of a series of voices, Michael Pollan, some others, who have clearly germinated seeds of change that have now blossomed. And like, that's really impressive. And I think you could do a little self back-patting occasionally for that. So keep doing what you're doing, and we will keep listening to what you say.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maya. So we covered a lot of ground there in a pretty short period of time. We didn't get to some of the pushback, which, you know, people might have listening to this. But I do find Maya's columns to be extremely educational, especially when she says that there are a lot of myths out there that need to be rewritten. That's how I've certainly found my like limited educational experience paying attention to this conversation, that most of the pop knowledge that I had in my head about addiction don't turn out to be correct. And what works when it comes to addiction don't turn out to be correct.
So I think not doing a lot of the pushback in that conversation is fine, especially because the pushback remains the dominant discussion anyway. That those stories and those realities are so palpably part of our collective awareness about the use of drugs. And look, part of the problem, which Maya does really well to draw attention to, is the line between scheduled substances, illegal and prescribed, in terms of their pharmacology or in terms of their intensity, is a completely arbitrary one. You know, the human body doesn't know from fentanyl to OxyContin to heroin to pot to psychedelics whether these substances are, you know, legal or illegal. It knows what the body is responding to as a substance. And there's a whole panoply of quote unquote drugs that are prescription based and legal, not including opioids, that are intensely powerful and can be intensely destructive, but they can also be intensely constructive. You know, most of these things were created for a purpose that was good, not a purpose that was bad. Most of the things that we call scheduled substances, human beings started doing because of a very natural and cross-cultural need to escape, or a need to transcend consciousness, or a need to have fun. You know, you name it. Every culture for time of human beings have been altering their minds forever, and are likely to continue to do so. So I'm, for one, very sort of surprised and delighted that the conversation has become more nuanced, has become broader, has changed the knee-jerk black and white simplicity that our culture has dealt with. I guess the opioids is a bit of that's pretty black and white the way we deal with it right now. But I think these are good changes in our society. Good in that we are developing a greater maturity and sophistication about how we look at these things and weigh the risks and weigh the benefits and weigh how we manage both.
Yeah, and I do see, like, in the long run that you could take some of the things that we're wrestling with right now, that we feel are going nowhere. And it's not so ridiculous, given this conversation that we just had about drugs, that 50 years from now we would be in a completely different place, or 20 years from now.
Right, you can do that, like politically. Oh, nothing will ever change politically, or nothing will ever change in the way the structures of American democracy work, or nothing will change about attitudes about climate. Things change, and they change dramatically, and they change substantially. It's sometimes not clear when, and only when you're on the other side of that inflection point are you able to go, oh, right, that changed. But as you just pointed out, Emma, the way in which these things have shifted about attitudes, about how we manage substances and the laws and how we deal with addiction, like, that's changed dramatically in 10 years in a way that, as I said at the beginning, I would never have guessed 30 years ago. And we could be saying the same thing about our political systems or about our economic systems. They look like they're sclerotic. They look like they're set in stone forever, until everything shifts.
I would sum that up as failure is an instructive teacher. and at some point, you got to do something new.
Absolutely is. All right, shall we talk about the news?
Yes, let's do it. We're going to start with a fairly controversial topic, depending on who you ask in the United States, which is guns. There are pretty large swaths of the American public that agree on several different kinds of gun measures. So kind of the voter approval is there, but obviously from a legislative sense, things are a lot more difficult. So just starting with Team Blue right now, if you're on Team Blue, this will be exciting for you. If you're not on Team Blue, you can skip the next 30 seconds of this podcast. Washington just became the latest state to ban assault rifles instead of semi-automatic weapons. It does need to withstand a court challenge, so we'll see what happens around that. The ban that Illinois passed earlier in the year is right now in limbo in the courts, although they think that the ban will be upheld. And Colorado, which was once purple, now bluish, also just passed 4 new gun measures, which have to do with introducing a waiting period, that have to do with expanding red flag laws, and a couple of other things. So if you are on Team Blue and you're really big on bans, mandates, legislation as a whole, there are some things that have been done very recently that you can feel happy about.
Well, there you go. Here's to the Team Blue side. And that may even be putting it in too stark a terms. There's a lot of people who are staunchly in favor of Second Amendment gun ownership rights, who feel that semi-automatic weapons, or at least unfettered access to semi-automatic weapons, is questionable at best.
You're right. I shouldn't really say Team Blue or Team Red. I'm sort of doing it for ease, but maybe for Team Red, Team Purple, part of Team Blue. Something interesting just happened, which is that smart guns are now on sale in the U.S. for the first time ever.
Tonight, we take a look at a gun company with the goal of making firearms safer. They're developing what they're calling the personalized gun, a firearm designed to only be fired by an authenticated user, in this case, using his or her own fingerprint. But will smart gun technology be able to reduce the rising level of gun-related deaths in this country?
This has been around as a concept since the early millennium, since the Clinton administration. They asked gun manufacturers to try to develop them. There was so much blowback from gun owners and the NRA that the big gun manufacturers just dropped the idea, partly because of that and partly because they just couldn't get them to work. And what happened is that a 15-year-old who was from Colorado, he lived half an hour away from the Aurora shooting that happened a while ago now. He was really perturbed by that. He started on this project to develop a smart gun. He's now 26 years old, and they are finally for sale. And if we can trust, some reporters at NPR and Bloomberg and other outlets, they actually work. And of course, the benefit of smart guns being that if a child picks it up, they can't fire it. If someone steals a gun from you, they can't fire it. It's only going to be for an authorized user of that gun. So cool. It remains to be seen now if people will buy them.
Traditionally, we have thought of the problem of gun violence in a pretty narrow way, simply as a criminal matter to deal with exclusively through our criminal justice system. By thinking of it as a public health problem, it really expands the way that you can think about potential solutions.
After guns, something definitely less controversial and a little bit of an antidote to some of the nostalgia that people feel about, the times used to be much better. We used to have quite a few serial killers out on the loose in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in the hundreds, actually, active serial killers. And now if you look at the new data that's come out, we are back to like 1930s, 1940s levels. Something like 30 active serial killers. So we've seen substantial drops. And that has to do with better policing, better tech, better surveillance, all these things. So it's weird because it seems to come with a accompanying rise of anxiety with parents. Like they feel nervous about leaving their kids around these days. But at least when it comes to abductions and killers, we're actually in a much better place than we used to be 50 years ago.
Man, that's going to be a real problem for streaming services and Hollywood, which has made such a rich source material of show after show and movie after movie about hunting the serial killer, finding the serial killer, getting in the mind of the serial killer. If there's no longer an adequate source of serial killers, you're going to have to find a whole other source to inspire your shows. So I mean that's the one, I guess, downside of the absence of of serial killers. And for those who may not be able to identify my sarcasm, that was an example of it.
Well, the good news for Netflix and so on is that they can always just go back into the 70s. There were plenty.
That's right.
There were plenty.
That's right. They can just do the historical version thereof.
Exactly.
Do we have anything else this week other than the decline of serial killers and the rise of smart guns? I don't know.
Yes, let's touch on India really briefly. People may or might not know that India's population officially surpassed China's. And people might be wondering, why do we care? Well, we care because Morgan Stanley is forecasting that India's economy is going to become the third largest in the world by 2027, meaning India is going to become a major player. And we can talk about the geopolitical ramifications of that, but sort of inside all of that is also the fact that life has been getting a lot better for people in India. They have had internet access skyrocket, electricity access skyrocket. They have this cool system from the government that 99.9% of all adult Indians have a digital ID, which means they can send financial transfers from the government, direct payments without dealing with corruption or skimming. They can set up a bank account really easily, which anyone living in Greece will know that's something to be jealous about.
Anyone living in the United States. I mean, it's
Yep.
We still have lots of documentation. You got to go in person. I mean, it's hard to do here. It's hard to do everywhere. As Progress Network member Fareed Zakaria pointed out in his columns this week, I was also in India in March. You really do feel like there's a certain cliched wind at the sails feeling. And while some of the trends you talked about, economic growth forecasts have been pretty robust for 25 years, and India has failed to sort of keep pace with its promise. That's probably the best way to put it. Both this digital, bringing everyone into the digital sphere, essentially, isn't just about the ease of like financial transactions. It's also developers can develop tools. It's more of like an open source platform that on the one hand provides for high levels of privacy, but also high levels of public good. If we talked about China as the X factor in the global economic and political system, let's say from 2000 till now, we may be well talking about India from here until whenever then is.
So we'll see pretty soon, I think. And that's all we have for today. So thank you, Zachary.
That's all we have for today. Thank you, Emma. We will be back next week. Thank you all for listening.